The Arizona sun hung low over the desert in 1887, casting long shadows across the red earth as Samuel Cooper rode his chestnut mare through the unforgiving landscape, a man alone in a land where trust was a luxury few could afford. Samuel was a cattle rancher, 32 years old, weathered by years of drought and hardship, his small homestead barely surviving on the edge of Apache territory, a place where most white settlers feared to tread. He'd spent the morning checking his fences along the northern boundary, the work slow and tedious, when he heard something that made him pull his horse to a stop, a sound that didn't belong in the desert silence. It was a low moan barely audible over the wind coming from behind a cluster of sagebrush about 50 yards to his left, and every instinct told him to ride away to mind his own business in a land where involvement often meant death. But Samuel had never been good at turning away from suffering, a trait his late father had called both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness, and today would prove that assessment more accurate than he could have imagined. He dismounted slowly, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, his eyes scanning the brush for any sign of danger or ambush, his heart pounding as he moved forward with careful, measured steps. What he found behind those bushes changed everything. A young Apache woman no more than 25 lying on her side with a deep gash across her leg, blood soaking into the sand beneath her, her face pale with shock and pain. Her eyes met his with a mixture of fear and defiance, her hand gripping a small knife too weak to raise it but determined not to die without a fight. And Samuel could see she'd been there for hours, maybe since the night before. "I'm not going to hurt you," Samuel said quietly, raising his hands to show they were empty, though he knew she probably didn't speak English. And even if she did, words meant little out here where actions were the only currency that mattered. He could see the wound was severe, probably from a fall or a struggle. The bleeding had slowed, but infection would set in soon if it wasn't treated, and leaving her here meant certain death, a fact they both understood without words. Samuel made a decision that defied every rule of survival in the Arizona territory. He tore strips from his own shirt and approached her, slowly kneeling beside her, despite the knife she still held, despite the danger, despite knowing that Apache warriors might be searching for her at this very moment. She watched him with dark, calculating eyes as he cleaned the wound with water from his canteen, her jaw clenched against the pain, and when he began to bandage her leg with the cloth strips, she finally lowered the knife, her hand trembling from exhaustion and blood loss. "Can you ride?" Samuel asked, gesturing toward his horse, knowing the answer even before she tried to stand, her leg buckling immediately, her body too weak from injury and exposure to support her weight. The problem was clear and immediate. She needed medical attention. His homestead was 8 miles away, and his mare, as strong as she was, couldn't carry them both that distance. Not through this terrain, not in this heat. Samuel looked at his horse, his only horse, the animal that meant the difference between survival and ruin for a rancher, the mare he'd raised from a foal and depended on for everything, and then he looked back at the dying woman before him. What happened next would have seemed insane to anyone who knew the tensions between settlers and Apache in 1887, a time when attacks and reprisals had created a cycle of violence that left little room for mercy or trust on either side. Samuel helped the woman onto his horse, using all his strength to lift her into the saddle, her body limp and yielding as he positioned her carefully, making sure she wouldn't fall. And then he did something that would echo through the desert for generations. He took the reins and pointed the mare north in the direction of the Apache lands, slapped her hindquarters, and sent his only horse away, carrying the wounded woman toward her people, while he stood alone in the desert with nothing but the long walk home ahead of him. The woman looked back at him as the horse began to move, her eyes wide with confusion and something else, something that might have been respect or disbelief, and then she was gone, disappearing into the shimmering heat waves that rose from the desert floor. Samuel began the 8-mile walk back to his homestead under the punishing afternoon sun, his water running low, his feet blistering in his boots, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life or done the only thing his conscience would allow. He reached his small ranch house after dark, exhausted and dehydrated, his hands shaking as he pumped water from the well, and as he collapsed onto his porch, he couldn't stop thinking about that mare. Gone now, probably forever. The next morning arrived with the harsh reality of his situation. Samuel had cattle to tend, fences to mend, and no horse to do it with. His neighbors would call him a fool when they found out, assuming he lived long enough for them to hear the story. He was in his barn repairing a saddle he no longer had a horse for when he heard them, a sound that made his blood run cold, the thunder of hoofbeats, dozens of them coming fast toward his property from the north. Samuel grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, his heart hammering as he saw them cresting the ridge. Apache warriors, at least 70 of them, riding in formation, their faces painted, weapons ready, and at their head, riding his chestnut mare, was the woman he'd saved, sitting tall now, her leg bandaged properly. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run, to barricade himself inside, but there was nowhere to go, no escape from 70 mounted warriors, and so Samuel stood his ground, his rifle lowered but ready, prepared to face whatever justice or vengeance they'd come to deliver. The warriors surrounded his property in a wide circle, their horses snorting and stamping, the morning sun glinting off rifle barrels, and the metal points of lances, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than any war cry could have been. The woman dismounted from Samuel's mare, moving carefully on her injured leg, and beside her was an older warrior, his face lined with age and authority, wearing the symbols of a chief, his eyes fixed on Samuel with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through him. She spoke to the chief in Apache, her words rapid and emphatic, gesturing toward Samuel and then toward her bandaged leg, and the old warrior listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, a lifetime of war and wisdom written in the deep lines of his face. Samuel had heard stories of Apache justice swift and absolute, and he wondered if helping the woman had somehow violated a tribal law he didn't understand, if his act of mercy would be seen as an insult or interference, if these 70 warriors had come for retribution. The chief dismounted and walked toward Samuel slowly, each step deliberate and measured, and Samuel noticed that despite the rifles and weapons surrounding him, the old warrior's hands were empty, his posture not threatening, but formal, ceremonial even. When the chief stood before him just 3 feet away, he studied Samuel's face for what felt like an eternity, and then he did something that shocked every man present. He placed his right hand over his heart and bowed his head, a gesture of profound respect in Apache culture. Through a younger warrior who spoke English, the chief's words were translated. "You gave your only horse to my daughter, knowing you might never see it again, knowing she was Apache, knowing the danger, and you asked for nothing in return." Samuel felt his throat tighten as he realized the woman he'd saved wasn't just any Apache. She was the daughter of Chief Nantan, one of the most respected leaders among the Chiricahua Apache, a man whose word carried weight across the entire territory. "In our way," the chief continued through the translator, "such an act creates a debt that must be honored. You showed mercy when you could have shown indifference. You gave what you could not afford to lose, and you sent my daughter home when you could have bargained for reward or ransom." What happened next became legend in the Arizona territory. The 70 warriors began to dismount, and from their packs they brought gifts, blankets woven with intricate patterns, dried meat, turquoise stones, handcrafted tools, and then they brought something that made Samuel's knees nearly buckle. From the back of the formation, warriors led forward not 1 horse but 5, strong, healthy animals, 4 mares and a young stallion, their coats gleaming in the morning sun, horses that would transform Samuel's struggling ranch from barely surviving to genuinely prosperous. The chief spoke again, his voice carrying authority and emotion. "These horses are yours. But more than this, I give you my word. No Apache will harm you or take from your land. You will have safe passage through our territory, and if you ever need help, you send word and we will come." The woman Samuel had saved stepped forward, her eyes meeting his, and though they shared no common language, the gratitude and respect in her gaze needed no translation, and she handed him the reins to his chestnut mare, returned to him along with so much more. Samuel accepted the reins with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening, and he managed to speak through the translator. "I didn't do it for reward. I did it because leaving her there would have meant leaving part of my own humanity in that desert." The chief nodded slowly, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "That is why you receive this honor. A man who acts without expectation of gain is a man who can be trusted, and trust in these hard times is worth more than all the horses in the territory." Before the warriors left, the chief's daughter approached Samuel one more time. She reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small carved piece of turquoise shaped like a horse and pressed it into his palm, closing his fingers around it with both her hands. Through the translator, she said simply, "You gave me my life I will not forget." And then she mounted her own horse, and with a signal from her father, the 70 warriors turned and rode back toward the mountains, leaving Samuel standing in his yard. 5 new horses, his returned mare, and a guarantee of safety that was unprecedented in the violent history of the Arizona frontier. News of what happened spread through the territory like wildfire. Settlers couldn't believe that a man had given his only horse to an Apache and received not violence but honor in return. And many claimed Samuel must have embellished the story, that such things didn't happen in the real world. But Samuel's ranch prospered over the following years. His herd grew with the help of his new horses, and true to the chief's word, he never lost a single head of cattle to raids, never faced trouble when crossing through Apache lands, and several times when his fences were damaged by storms, he'd find them mysteriously repaired by morning. Other ranchers began to notice. They saw that the one man who'd shown mercy was the one man who lived in peace, and slowly, grudgingly, some of them began to reconsider their own attitudes, to see that the cycle of violence could be broken by acts of unexpected compassion. Samuel kept that carved turquoise horse on his mantle for the rest of his life, a reminder of the day he learned that humanity transcends culture, that mercy is never wasted, and that sometimes the greatest rewards come from the moments when we choose kindness over fear. The story of Samuel Cooper and Chief Nantan's daughter became one of the few bright moments in a dark chapter of American history, proof that even in times of terrible conflict, individual acts of courage and compassion could bridge divides that seemed impossibly wide. Years later, when Samuel was an old man, he was asked if he'd been afraid standing there facing 70 Apache warriors, and his answer was simple: terrified. But I was more afraid of becoming the kind of man who could leave a dying woman in the desert to save his own property. Some things matter more than survival. The lesson echoes across time, reminding us that our truest character is revealed not in moments of comfort, but in the choices we make when compassion costs us something, when mercy requires sacrifice, and when doing the right thing means risking everything we have. Samuel Cooper gave his only horse to save a stranger, and in return he received not just material wealth but something far more valuable: the knowledge that he'd lived up to the man he wanted to be, that he'd chosen humanity over hatred, and that sometimes the unthinkable response to an act of kindness is an even greater act of honor in return. Retry.